Hey everyone, and welcome to this talk brought to you by Latinx in Games. Um, this shouldn't be a surprise if you're here, but if you are, let me give you a little background. This talk is going to be me going over the history of Latinx game characters, and then kind of following up with where do we think we can go next with that idea. Um, so let's talk. Let me just quickly give you some background on me and who I work for and why I'm here. So I am a co-founder of Latinx in Gaming. Latinx in Gaming is a pretty cool advocacy group that works within the gaming space to help support, promote, and increase diversity within games and also within the gaming industry itself. It was founded in 2017 and it's now a nonprofit. If you want to check out the things that we do, which are really cool, you can go to latinxingaming.com. Also, we have a Twitch channel, which you should check out at the end of the stream. What I'm going to try and do is be live on that stream when this happens because I'm pre-recording this whole thing. And what I'll do is I'll be able to answer your questions there on stream. So it's twitch.tv/Latinx in Games. You should come hang out with us. I'll put a link in chat. Probably I'll be lurking. But anyway, hi, what's up? Good to see you. About me, my name is Joe Tirado. I'm the comms and marketing lead at Systemera Softworks. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm the co-founder of Latinx in Games. And before this, I worked in all sorts of industries doing creative stuff. So working in movies and television and the graphic design world, working at creative agencies, making content. So I have a good background in a lot of different things. And I've been in games now for about 5 years or so. Okay, cool. So what we're going to cover today, we want to go through the major sort of inflection points in the history of games and call out points where Latinx game characters are there. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of those. And then talk about some major milestones within the history of Latinx in game characters. This isn't going to be an exhaustive list. I wish I had the time to really go through and pick out every single game character, but that's just not possible within the scope of what we're doing here today. And we're going to talk about some good and bad examples and why they're good and why they're bad, and kind of go in between and figure out and pull out the good stuff while also being honest about what isn't working necessarily with some of these characters. Okay, so some background that'll be, I think, helpful for everyone. The math. So just popular culture type stuff. 20% of moviegoers are Latinx. That means 1 in 4 people who are buying a movie ticket in North America are actually Latinx descent, which is crazy to think about. 18% of the U.S. population is Latinx, which is, I don't think, a surprise. We're the second largest group of people that live here. And then just another sort of thing here, 397 million gamers in Latin America. So that's a lot of people. I'm sure there's many millions in the United States and across the world. So something to be thinking about. Unfortunately, with all this math, we aren't actually represented at all. I mean, you can read up on statistics about our representation in games, in popular media, in movies and television shows, and it is abysmal. It's awful. So let's talk about what good representation looks like. Unfortunately, I wanted to like pull some examples, but there's just like not a lot of them. Like it's just they don't exist. I know there are characters, but I just mean like I don't have a plethora of them to choose from. So what I think good representation means, and an important way to define it, is a good representation is free of stereotypes. So people are not you're not reducing people down to their basest form in order to present it. Especially when you're talking about the next point on here, which is the diversity within Latinx. So I'm Colombian, but I'm also Puerto Rican, and I grew up in the United States. My version of Latinx is going to look way different than someone who is Colombian and Puerto Rican but grew up in Puerto Rico or grew up in Colombia. And so there's a humongous amount of diversity within Latinx cultures, even within countries of Latinx. I mean, it's a wide variety of people, and so sometimes I don't even like necessarily using a term like Latinx or Latino or Latina because you are basically bucketing a lot of people together who don't always reconcile with each other. And I mean that in a way of just like they're just going to have completely different interests and needs. The needs of someone who is born in the United States, who is went to American schools, is going to be completely different than the needs of someone who grew up in Puerto Rico and experienced that school infrastructure. So just something to be thinking about. Like within regions and countries, you're seeing different cultures and customs. And then so for a good representation, most characters that you want to see that represent you or you can put yourself into, they have a purpose beyond tokenism. And what we're going to see a lot of is tokenism and options, right? Like there are only Latinx characters because they just needed more options, and this was a way to add more variation to a game. But they're not necessarily core to the experience. They're just there as a way to give you a bigger menu, which is not really cool and not what you want. And then also what you want for good representation is characters that are grounded in reality. So people who have actual real motives that match up with things that you're into, or people who are written in a way that doesn't just like focus on their Latinx-ness and nothing else, which I think happens quite a bit, unfortunately. That we want characters with depth that feel real, that feel like they're grounded in the Latinx experience, which can be very wide and shouldn't be boiled down to the sort of tropes that we're seeing very often. We don't want to be another option in a fighter list or a character choice screen. We want to be there, contributing to the story, and doing so in a meaningful way. So stereotypes. This is one of the biggest things that characters of the pitfalls of a Latinx character, if you're writing one or if you're putting one in your game or if you're playing as one. Unfortunately, there are these existing stereotypes that kind of tread the same ground very often, and what ends up happening is because that ground gets treaded, people who aren't necessarily exposed to Latinx people or people who aren't necessarily exposed to Latinx culture don't explore it anymore in order to come up with cool new versions of ways to represent Latinx characters, which then means that people don't even try, right? They go, oh, well, we can't do the luchador thing, we can't do the drug dealer thing, and we can't do the sexy lady thing, so we're just not going to put a Latinx character in there at all. Which, if you're writing game characters or if you are creating games with Latinx characters in them, I challenge you to come up with more interesting ways to represent the game characters in a way that just doesn't walk in these same paths, because it's tired, it's busted. Like no one is into this kind of stuff. That's not to say that luchador culture is bad. I don't think it's bad, but I think unfortunately in popular culture it has been treated so similarly that people are looking at it and say, why even do this? Okay, so why are they harmful? They take away your agency as a person of Latinx descent, right? You start to look at those things and you feel like everyone who looks at you, or if you identify with Latinx culture, that people are just going to look at you and prescribe those tropes and those stereotypes to you with you not even doing anything, by just existing. They perpetuate harmful ideas, right? They're putting ideas out in the world that are not good, but also like can be dangerous to like you and how people view you in the world. So they can be more than just hurtful. They can be super harmful to you in a way that is pretty scary. And then also I've fallen into this trap where everyone sort of has this point of reference about Latinx people, and then you just like fall into the trap of like living that life or towing the line that is previously there, because that's all people know, and you don't even want to spend the time to try and like expose them to other parts of your culture, because they're just going to brand you as sombrero or this or that, which is like super treaded ground. So they're really bad, and we should try and eliminate them as much as possible. Okay, so let's go back. I just like this GIF. It doesn't really have anything to do with what we're showing off right now. Pardon me, need some coffee. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a quick crash course in video game history. You could spend many hours talking about what is happening on this timeline between 1965 to 1980. We're gonna breeze through it, but I think it's important to talk about, um, especially because when you talk about representation, I mean, you're talking about 15, 20 years passing, and there's just like literally none. I'll let you off the hook there. Between 1970 and 1980 plus, there is no representation of Latinx characters. It's partially due to the medium, so I'll get into that. So, before 1970, video games are mostly distributed between high-level thinkers, people who have big computers at their schools, researchers. They're using the processing power to create games. I think the first game that you might think of as far as the modern gaming industry comes in 1971/1970 in Pong. It's an arcade cabinet. It's a co-op game. Games existed before this, but not video games, right? Before this and during this time and all throughout this time, you're still seeing people play pinball machines and other arcade things. They just don't play games. And so in 1971, Pong comes out, changes all that. It's a video game. It's what you would consider a video game today. In 1972, the first video game console comes out, and that is the Magnavox Odyssey. So unfortunately, this console is basically just a Pong for your home. It's got that little controller, and you spin the wheels to move your paddles, but that's about it. It doesn't do anything else. It doesn't swap out. It just plays Pong, but it's a Pong home machine. So some really cool stuff happens. 1976, 1978 are when some of the most important, like the video game industry and the video game console industry, go through these like iterations where, you know, it's about arcade cabinets, then it's maybe about consoles, then it's maybe about you know, like they kind of swap and switch around. But in 76, Breakout comes out, and that's like a huge success for Atari and kind of establishes them as like as a mainstay in the industry. They'd already been doing stuff. And then in 1978, Space Invaders comes out, and this is one of the first games that kind of does things that modern games do, which is like records a score, it has lives, and it's tracking those. It has different levels. It's kind of doing some stuff that like previously hadn't necessarily been thought about before. And then in 1979, Pac-Man comes out, and that's where you start to actually see video game characters, where you start to see franchises being built around specific characters in games. And I think actually in 1980 as well, like right after Pac-Man, that's when like the first Donkey Kong game comes out, which is the one with Mario climbing the ladders. So you start to actually see franchises appearing and characters being put out there. 1980 is the first handheld. You know, so you're seeing a lot of advancements in video games, but none of this stuff is happening within Latinx culture. None of it is being really, a lot of it's not really being produced by Latinx people. It's usually Japanese or you know, people with access to certain kinds of technology. So we're going to jump forward from, so you got the little crash course, you know where the lay of the land is. You got some video game consoles existing. You have arcade games still being really popular. You have video games starting to become a thing that rely on character development. And then in 1982, this happens. So at this point, the Atari 2600 I think has been out for a year, maybe more. And this is one of the first video game consoles that is like what you would think of today. It's got multiple games. You swap them in and out. You plug it into your TV. And for my money, the first, I guessed, representation of Latinx culture within video games looks like this. So yeah, you know, 12, 16 pixels on a screen, on a pitch. And I wouldn't necessarily call this representation, but we'll get into that more later. But this is actually where the Latinx people kind of get involved in the gaming industry. And I think it's no surprise that it has to do with football. So, yeah, Pele Soccer comes out in 1982, and it's one of the first games that actually includes the likeness of a person in order to sell it. So I'll just give you a little a little taste of what that
At
looks like.
Atari, our game cartridges undergo grueling tests. We put Kareem Abdul-Jabbar up against Atari basketball.
Oh, man, what a move.
We let Mario Andretti test drive Atari Night Driver.
This game really cracks me up.
And the great Pele himself tested Pele's championship soccer.
What a gig, it beats me again.
At Atari, we take our games seriously, so you have more fun.
How'd you do, Kareem?
Glad I won't face Atari in the playoffs.
No other video game company
Look at how much taller he was than both of them. So as you can see here, it's an ad calling out the fact that like they got multiple games in different genres. They got 40 of them, and you plug them in there. So for my money, this is actually where Latinx people get involved in video games, and people see how Latinx characters can actually be really beneficial. Unfortunately, at this point, most video game characters are like literally just box art, and then you play some pixels and you kind of put your mind in there. But it still is a pretty interesting one to call out, because I think it's a theme that we'll talk about later. It kicks off a theme that I'll talk about later. So the verdict on Pele as a video game character: Pele's cool. He's one of the most well-known people on the planet at this point. I mean, everyone knows who the guy is, and that's actually really cool that they showcase him for this thing. Unfortunately, I don't think he counts as the first video game character, because it's like just a square on a screen, and there's no like name, there's nothing. It was